will post online for you. There are tons of them, and it was just too many for us to copy in a handout. So those will be available at EVFA's website for you to take a look at. Dr. Stephanie Hines is a board-certified pediatrician, and she's currently the Assistant Director at the Center for Human Development, a division of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics at Beaumont Children's Hospital in Royal Oak. She has been selected as one of Metro Detroit's top docs for many years, and she's currently listed in the Detroit Super Doctors. She's a consultant for ABC News on autism and related disorders, and has been presenting on that topic as well as on learning disabilities to a wide variety of groups for a number of years. We're thrilled to have her here with us today, and please help me welcome Dr.
Hines. Okay. Can people hear? This is not too big of an auditorium. I'm used to much bigger auditoriums. Well, thank you for having me. This is a huge topic to cover, and I will tell you that probably the first 30 slides I probably could have made into a topic in and of itself, just the whole time, okay? All right. So I'm going to try my best to get through it, and I know that you all in here are parents, so I try to gear it so that, that there's not too much techno information in it. But I wanted to start off with a case. It actually goes back a number of years, and it involves the little boy right up here in the front holding the puppy. His name is John. And John's early development seemed pretty normal. You know, he walked on time, did all that stuff, but his language was delayed. He wasn't talking as much as his sisters had done at that age. And his mother was somewhat concerned about that, and she talked to her doctor about it, and he said not to worry, that John had older sisters that were talking for him, and that's the reason he was delayed with his language. Well, when he got into the early elementary years, first and second grade, he was struggling. He was struggling to learn his ABCs, learn his letters, learn basic sight words, basic reading. And in second grade, his mother had him evaluated through the school district, and he didn't qualify to receive any services. So he continued to struggle and have difficulties, especially with reading. But he's very athletic, got out there and played soccer and climbed apple trees and had a lot of friends. And then, this is part of his evaluation, but this is then high school. Once he got to high school, things got a little bit better, because in high school now you can kind of pick and choose some of your classes. So he picked drafting and photography and did much better in those classes, but practically failed Spanish and had difficulty with more of the language-based type activities. So English, social studies, history, things like that. But he did graduate, and now he's in his 40s, and he's married, and he does construction. And I know his case so well because he's my brother. And a couple years ago, I actually talked him into coming up to Michigan to be assessed at the center. And John does have the classical signs of dyslexia, which is a language-based learning disability. So for the past 15 years, I've been very interested in learning disabilities, even though I didn't get much training during my fellowship on that. I've been very interested in learning disabilities, especially dyslexia, which is a specific language-based learning disability. So what are we dealing with? This is learning disabilities in general. It's actually quite prevalent. 1 in 10 children will have a learning disability. And if you look at a classroom setting, you go into any school, anywhere between 5 to 10% of children in that setting will have learning struggles. And if you look at the U.S. Department of Education statistics, it's about the same number. It's about 5% of those children, school-age children, receiving services for a learning disability. And if you look at any one academic year, here it came back from the 2000-2001, you've got over 2.5 million kids who are receiving special education services for learning disabilities. That represents about a half of all the children who receive special education. Okay, so how do we define a learning disability? This can become kind of tricky. If you look at the Individuals with Disabilities Act, that's IDEA, it's a federal law that provides special education services. This is their definition. It's very wordy. And if you can understand that, kudos to you, because I'm not sure I totally understand it. But it's a disorder in one of the basic processes that makes it more difficult to do things in school. So to read, to write, to spell, to do math. Now the DSM-4, which is kind of the Bible in our field, and in the mental health field, defines a learning disability as achievement on standardized tests being substantially below a level that would be expected for your age, your intelligence, and your level of schooling. Okay, so the trick here is trying to define substantially below. What does that mean? School districts have gotten so they define substantially below in a somewhat arbitrary fashion and based on their funding. So years ago, substantially below could mean a 12-point discrepancy between your cognitive functioning and your achievement. If money's kind of tight, then it might be stretched out to 15 points or even 20. So it can become somewhat arbitrary, and it's by no means standardized from one school district to the next. So that in and of itself is kind of a definition that can be tricky as well. I always tell my residents, medical students who are working with me, that a learning disability is basically a gap between an individual's cognitive or problem-solving abilities, what they can do at home and in the community, versus their achievement in school. Not their behavior, but achievement. How they can do with spelling and math and reading. That gap is a learning disability. And again, that gap can be hard to define. You know, what do you consider that gap to be significant? And a similar analogy is when I was in medical school, we defined hypertension, high blood pressure, as 140/90. That was the number we went with. Well, now the number's been lowered. We've learned that 130/80 is probably the number we should go with to define hypertension. So see how it can get kind of tricky? It's really all a continuum, and probably even a more useful way of looking at it is to define a learning disability as a variation in brain functioning that interferes with learning. So if someone is struggling with learning, we probably should figure out why. So this is a heterogeneous group, okay? Again, like I mentioned, it's kind of hard to define it. And there's all different types of learning profiles. And originally the title of this talk was How Do Children Learn? That's just way too hard to kind of wrap your brain around. And that's because so many kids learn in different ways. There's all different sorts of profiles. It's when a child is having difficulties meeting the expectations in the classroom that it becomes really problematic. These are the possible learning disabilities. We can have it in language, we can have it in reading, in math, and written expression. Those are kind of the check boxes that you can have on an IEP, an individualized education plan, that a school can check to certify your child to have a learning disability. You can also get services for speech and language impairment, or for autism, or for having cerebral palsy. But when you're looking at learning disabilities, those are kind of the categories it falls into. Now, the most significant impairment in individuals with a language-based learning disability, and language-based learning disabilities are by far the most common. They account for about 90% of all the learning disabilities. And of language-based learning disabilities, the most common is a reading disability. Okay, so basically dyslexia. All right, those terms are kind of used synonymously. In the school district, there's no little checkbox for dyslexia. It's a reading disability. Dyslexia is more of a neurological or medical term. Okay, but the primary difficulty in dyslexia is reading. Okay, so it translates into the school system as a reading disability. And this is the official definition of dyslexia from the International Dyslexia Association. And if you kind of distill this down and look at it a little bit more, the key terms here are neurobiologic, so it has to do with, it's in the brain, it's not the eyes. Okay, for a long time, individuals with dyslexia were thought to have vision problems. And in fact, the first people who wrote about dyslexia and identified dyslexia were actually ophthalmologists back in the late 1800s. They weren't psychologists. It was ophthalmologists who realized it's not an eye problem. It's more of a deep-rooted language processing problem. Okay, so it's neurobiologic. There's difficulties with word recognition and spelling and decoding, and it results in difficulties in the classroom with reading comprehension. Later on, as you get older, it has an impact on growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. Because essentially individuals with dyslexia have difficulties reading. Reading is not fun.